Have you ever wondered what it would be like to fake an engagement and end up trapped in feelings that should never exist? This is exactly where our story begins, an unlikely agreement between two people who never imagined they'd need each other. Juliet Carter, a young architect with a dream, was about to lose everything. Her hard-earned company was in danger of disappearing amid debt and doors closing one by one. This story goes beyond a simple fake engagement. It reveals how, behind the masks, love can transform everything. If this beginning has already awakened something in you, like and subscribe to the channel. That way, you can follow every detail of this intense plot that will surprise you. Juliet Carter always believed that passion was the force capable of moving the impossible. From a young age, she had decided that her life would be dedicated to architecture, to the dream of designing spaces that were not just concrete constructions, but places that held stories, feelings, and memories. With each stroke of her designs, she saw herself building not just houses, but bridges to a future that seemed increasingly distant. Because, despite her undeniable talent and creativity that enchanted clients, her small business was suffocated by debt, promised contracts that never materialized, and the cruel shadow of bankruptcy looming large. Juliet was strong, resilient, but even strength fades when reality insists on crushing dreams. It was as if, each morning, she woke to fight a battle she could not win. On the other side of this story was Alexander Reed, a name that carried weight, respect, and even fear in the business world. A billionaire with a razor-sharp strategic mind, he had conquered corporate empires without ever showing weakness. For many, he was the embodiment of success, rich, influential, unbeatable. But behind his perfect image lay unseen pressures. His investors, men and women who bet millions on his decisions, weren't just interested in numbers. They wanted stability, security, and, above all, the image of a balanced man capable of inspiring confidence even outside the boardroom. Alexander could run companies with a simple phone call, but he couldn't control how his personal life was perceived. In the eyes of the market, a single billionaire, surrounded by rumors and lacking solid emotional ties, was a threat disguised as charm. And it was in this contradiction that the worlds of Juliet and Alexander collided. She, on the edge between resisting and losing everything. He, pressured to reveal a side that wasn't part of his essence. Two opposites in extreme situations, pushed by fate toward an unlikely agreement. Juliet, her gaze marked by hope even amidst the chaos, carried within her the raw truth of someone who had nothing to lose but their dreams. Alexander, cold and calculating, hid beneath his iron walls the fragility of someone who knew that no power alone can sustain the confidence of an empire. The pressure on Juliet was almost unbearable. Bills piled up, deadlines grew ever closer, and the thought of laying off her few employees consumed her. Each lost contract felt like a direct blow to the chest, and the architect who dreamed of changing the world with her projects found herself being swallowed up by the cruel reality of the numbers. There were nights when she would remain alone in her small office, staring at the plans and drawings that had once been her pride, now transformed into painful reminders of everything that was about to slip away from her grasp. It was as if life had given her wings and then suddenly ripped the ground from under her feet. Alexander, for his part, had everything money could buy, but he lacked the essential, a compelling narrative. Investors didn't just want results, they wanted emotional guarantees. They wanted to believe that the man behind the empire was also capable of stability, constancy, and commitment. It wasn't enough to multiply profits, it was necessary to multiply trust. And for that, his image needed something he'd never had, the illusion of a solid bond, a relationship that could show the world he was more than a ruthless strategist. It was at this breaking point that life decided to toy with them both. Juliet and Alexander were on parallel paths, each battling invisible enemies that threatened to devour their existences. But fate has a curious way of bringing the improbable together. Sometimes, just when we think we're about to fall, the chance arises to hold a hand we never expected to find. A dreamy architect, a hard-pressed billionaire, two realities so distant they should never touch. But when extremes collide, what emerges can be as dangerous as it is irresistible. And it's precisely here that the real plot begins to unfold. Because when one desperate heart meets another imprisoned heart, the result isn't just a cold, calculated deal. It's the spark of something that threatens to break all the rules. And perhaps you can already imagine how that spark could ignite everything they thought they controlled. Now I want to hear from you. How far would you go to save a dream? Comment below if you believe that, in a situation like this, you would accept an unlikely deal to avoid losing everything. It was on a gala night that everything happened. A luxurious event, the kind where every detail seemed carefully rehearsed to convey power, wealth, and status. The halls were filled with businessmen, investors, and influential figures who never missed an opportunity to show off their connections. Alexander Reed, as always, was the center of attention. His presence drew glances, whispered comments, and a mixture of admiration and envy. He walked with the posture of someone who knew everyone was watching him, as if the entire room revolved around him. But that night, it wasn't the grandeur of the event that changed everything, but rather a small detail, almost an accident, that brought him face to face with Juliet Carter. Juliet didn't belong there. Her presence there was due to a last-minute invitation, a chance to find someone who could open doors for her struggling architecture firm. She wore a simple, elegant dress, but it clashed with the exuberant attire around her. She walked among the guests with the uncomfortable feeling of being an intruder in forbidden territory. And it was precisely in this environment where she felt out of place that the improbable happened, while trying to escape in arrogant conversation with a businessman who was mocking her projects. Juliet bumped into a tray of champagne, spilling some of the drink on her own dress, and, ironically, on Alexander's impeccable suit. The entire room seemed to fall silent for a few seconds. Everyone awaited the reaction of the man who rarely tolerated interruptions, much less public embarrassment. Juliet, embarrassed, hurriedly apologized, trying to clean up what seemed impossible to disguise. But, contrary to everyone's expectations, Alexander didn't explode in anger. On the contrary, he was intrigued. Amidst the awkwardness, there was something in Juliet's gaze that didn't yield to fear. She didn't try to flatter him, didn't seek to impress him, simply maintained the posture of someone who, despite the humiliating situation, would not lose her dignity. This raw authenticity awakened something in Alexander he hadn't known still existed: curiosity. After the incident, instead of walking away, Alexander sought her out. He struck up a casual conversation, with that calculated tone he used in negotiations, but he soon realized that Juliet wasn't like the people he usually surrounded himself with. She didn't seem interested in his last name, his fortune, or his influence. She spoke passionately about architecture, explaining how she believed spaces could change lives, and even amidst her difficulties, her eyes shone with conviction. Alexander, accustomed to empty speeches and self-serving smiles, found himself faced with someone who spoke of dreams, not numbers. And that's when a bold idea began to form in his mind. He needed to show investors that he was a stable man, someone capable of commitment, trust, and setting an example beyond the cold walls of business. Juliet desperately needed a chance to save her company before it was too late. The contract her lawyers were drafting couldn't give her what she truly possessed: credibility. And, on the other hand, her talent would never have been able to prevail without outside help. Two worlds so different, two needs so urgent. The fit was too clear to ignore. Alexander then made the proposal. Directly, bluntly, like someone accustomed to dictating the rules. He looked Juliet in the eye and said he could save her company, inject resources, open doors, and secure contracts that would keep her afloat. But there was one condition: she would have to pretend to be his fiancée for the next few months. She would have to accompany him to events, pose for cameras, smile in front of the press, and play the role of the woman who had captured his heart. It wouldn't be just an act, it would be a pact that would require discipline, discretion, and a willingness to give up her freedom for a time. Juliet was shocked. The proposal seemed absurd, almost offensive. Who did he think he was to offer something like that? How could he reduce her dignity to a staged role, as if she were an actress in a convenient theater? Anger rose in her throat, but at the same time, the harsh reality imposed itself like an inescapable shadow. Her company was on the brink of collapse, the employees who believed in her were at risk of losing their livelihoods, and the chance to rebuild everything alone seemed to disappear with each passing day. Alexander's words, cold and calculated, echoed in her mind, "I offer you a way out. You offer me an image. In the end, we both win." Juliet wanted to reject him, wanted to turn her back and prove that her life wasn't for sale. But the need, relentless and painful, pressed on her heart. That night, alone, she weighed every consequence. Would it be humiliating? Perhaps. Would it be risky? Definitely. But it would also be the only way to save the dreams she had fought for so many years. At their next meeting, her voice firm but her heart heavy, Juliet accepted. Not out of ambition, but for survival. From that moment on, she was trapped in an agreement that would change everything. An unlikely pact between a broke architect and a billionaire seeking stability. A game of appearances that, little by little, would begin to blur what was real and what was just an act. And this is where the fine line between lies and truth begins to be drawn, because when two such opposite lives intertwine, fate finds ways to transform even the coldest of contracts into something neither of them expected to face. The contract was drafted coldly, almost as if it were just another business transaction between two parties. The clauses were clear: no real involvement, no feelings, no room for the heart to interfere in what was supposed to be merely a game of appearances. Juliet felt swallowed by the words printed on the paper. Here was the representation of an agreement that would completely change her life. Each line seemed to rob her of a piece of freedom, but at the same time, it gave her back something she already believed lost: the chance to save her company. Alexander, with his firm, impassive tone, explained each point as if he were presenting a $1 million merger. She was to accompany him to social events, smile for the cameras, accept carefully prepared interviews. Appearances would be calculated, speeches rehearsed, and even the way they looked at each other in public should follow a script that conveyed trust and credibility. Juliet felt the weight of the farce even before signing it, but knew there was no going back. The following days were filled with intense preparation. Advisors, stylists, and image consultants all swirled around the new bride of tycoon Alexander Reed. Juliet, who had always lived simply, found herself forced to try on luxurious dresses, practice posture in front of mirrors, and repeat phrases that had nothing to do with her essence. It was like wearing a skin that didn't belong to her, but which would now be her identity before the world. Alexander observed everything with the same controlled calm as always, but deep down, there was a quiet curiosity within him. He wouldn't admit it out loud, but there was something magnetic in the way Juliet reacted to it all. She didn't try to completely mold herself, she maintained a flame of authenticity that emanated from even the most rigorous training sessions. Finally, the day of the first big test arrived, the official dinner in front of the press. It was the couple's public debut. The chosen restaurant was one of the most sophisticated in the city, reserved especially for the occasion. Outside, cameras and flashes were already awaiting every detail. Juliet took a deep breath, trying to control her nervousness. Alexander, beside her, maintained the same firm posture, as if it were just another unimportant event. But for Juliet, this was a dive into uncharted waters, a stage on which she would have to play the most difficult role of her life. When they entered together, the buzz was immediate. Eyes turned, journalists noted every gesture, every smile, every exchange of glances. Juliet felt the weight of the act in every muscle in her body. Her hands trembled slightly, and Alexander, noticing, discreetly touched her hand under the table, as if in a gesture of support. But even that simple touch was part of the act, and that was what frightened her most, not being able to distinguish where the lie ended and the need began. The questions began: how they met, what they admired most about each other, when they were planning their wedding. Juliet, trained, answered with short sentences, but sincere enough to convince. Alexander, with his ability to control any situation, completed the answers with the calm of someone who always had the last word. The public believed it, the press recorded it, but inside Juliet's mind there was silent chaos. Every rehearsed smile felt like a weight, every calculated look became a reminder of the prison she had placed herself in. During dinner, the discomfort was palpable. They could barely hide the awkwardness of sharing this space as a couple. There were moments when Juliet would get lost in her own thoughts, forgetting the script, and Alexander would quickly regain control with sharp turns of phrase. But every now and then, when she laughed inadvertently or let slip a spontaneous comment, something in his eyes would change. It wasn't just interest in the performance, it was a glimpse of something deeper, something he tried to suppress but which insisted on surfacing. Juliet, for her part, felt torn. On the one hand, there was the feeling of being manipulated in a dangerous game. On the other, there was a strange security in being by Alexander's side, as if, even amidst the farce, there was a solidity she couldn't explain. With each forced smile, her heart beat faster, not for fear of the audience's suspicions, but for the growing doubt: was she being swallowed up by the lie or starting to believe it? As dinner drew to a close, flashes illuminated the couple's exit. Juliet, dazzled by the lights, leaned on Alexander's arm as they had agreed. He leaned in slightly, whispering something she hadn't expected: "You're doing awfully well for someone who swears they can't lie." She smiled, unsure if it was a compliment, a tease, or the beginning of something she couldn't yet decipher. The car awaited them, and as they drove in silence through the illuminated city, Juliet couldn't shake the feeling that this contract was much more than a simple agreement. It was a carefully constructed trap by fate, where every movement, every word, and every look brought them closer to dangerous and unexplored territory. And in that silence, Juliet realized the farce had become a second skin. What should have been mere performance was beginning to stir her emotions deeply, and the same seemed to be happening to Alexander, even though he hid it behind his icy mask. The first official dinner had served its purpose in front of the press, but inside them, something much greater was being awakened. A confusing, intense feeling that threatened to break through all the barriers they had sworn to keep intact. The days following their first official dinner were a true test of endurance. The fake engagement contract, with all its cold and calculated rules, seemed easy to maintain on paper, but in practice it was a minefield where any misstep could ruin everything. Juliet Carter, with her authentic and spontaneous manner, simply couldn't live by a script. She didn't know how to mince words when faced with unexpected questions, couldn't force a smile when the situation seemed absurd. Alexander Reed, accustomed to controlling every detail of her life, every figure in her business, and every gesture in public, was deeply irritated by her naturalness. It was as if with each appearance together he was about to lose control of the performance. Arguments were frequent. Small things would turn into heated arguments. Juliet wouldn't accept him trying to dictate how she should dress, speak, or smile. "I'm not a puppet," she said firmly, leaving Alexander silent for a few seconds, as if such boldness were something he didn't know how to handle. He, on the other hand, couldn't understand how someone could be so unpredictable and yet so captivating. Deep down, what disarmed him most was Juliet's courage in facing him head-on, something few dared to do. But if there was tension within them, in public they could demonstrate nothing but perfection. At every social event, every press conference, every charity dinner, they were forced to appear the loving couple everyone believed them to be. Juliet had to smile, Alexander had to play the role of the loving fiancé, and the whole world watched. At one of these events, a charity ball, an episode occurred that would become a watershed moment. A moment's carelessness led Juliet to stumble on the steps leading to the main ballroom. Before she could fall in front of the cameras, Alexander caught her firmly, wrapping his arms around her waist. The gesture, though completely spontaneous, was captured by photographers as a scene of pure romance. The touch lingered longer than necessary, and Juliet felt the firmness of his hand contrast with a gaze that, for a few seconds, seemed devoid of any coldness. The media, of course, wasted no time. The next day, newspapers and magazines splashed the image as proof of the intense love between the two. To the public, their engagement was increasingly convincing. But for Juliet, what frightened her wasn't the headlines, but the feeling that, for the first time, Alexander had shown something genuine. She couldn't shake his expression from her mind, a look that seemed charged with something not even he would admit. And it wasn't just that moment. Little by little, between fights, small gestures began to reveal vulnerabilities Alexander had tried to hide. One night, after a long event, Juliet found him alone in his office, looking at an old photo tucked away in a drawer. It was a picture of his mother, and behind that indestructible facade lay a son who still carried unresolved pain. He didn't realize Juliet was watching him, but when their eyes met, there were no words. Only silence, a silence laden with unspoken truths. These details, almost imperceptible to anyone else, made Juliet see beyond the cold businessman's mask. She began to realize that Alexander wasn't just control and arrogance. He was also loneliness, a fear of betrayal, a desperate need to maintain an image because, without it, his entire empire could crumble. The more she uncovered these vulnerabilities, the harder it became to maintain the distance she had promised herself. And the same thing happened to him. Alexander, who had always believed feelings were weaknesses, began to perceive in Juliet a strength he found in no one else. She was able to face him fearlessly, but also to see what no one else saw. At social events, when she smiled genuinely, something in him broke. The contract said everything was supposed to be an act, but his heart insisted on breaking through the barriers they had built. Every embarrassing public situation only heightened this tension. At a business dinner, for example, an investor joked about how Juliet seemed too good to be true. Alexander, instead of laughing, held her hand tightly and responded with a conviction that surprised even Juliet, "She's exactly what I've always been looking for." The cameras caught it, the guests were moved, but Juliet knew there was nothing in the contract obligating him to say that. It was him, revealing more than he wanted. And here comes the point where I want you to reflect with me. How many times in your life have you had to pretend something until, suddenly, the pretense began to blend with reality? How many times have you tried to maintain control, only to realize that it's impossible to control your heart? Comment below if you've ever experienced something similar, or if you believe that love has the power to infiltrate even where there should only be lies. I really want to hear your perspective, because the exchange between us gives even more strength to this story to continue growing. What was supposed to be just another carefully calculated and protected performance by the terms of the contract took on new dimensions one unexpected weekend. It all began when Alexander, pressed by social commitments, was invited to attend a family gathering at his country house, a simple affair by his standards, but essential to maintaining the image of a committed, stable man connected to the people he loved. He didn't want to go alone, as this would further fuel rumors that the engagement was nothing more than a sham, so he took Juliet with him. The initial idea was to maintain the performance, controlled appearances, scripted smiles, and forged complicity. But no one could have predicted that, far from the cameras and flashbulbs of the press, what seemed like a performance would begin to become a dangerous reality. The country house was surrounded by vast gardens, discreet trails, and a tranquil lake that reflected the sunset like a golden mirror. There, without the weight of the concrete offices or the pressure of journalists, Juliet allowed herself to breathe. She didn't need to rehearse lines or repeat practiced gestures. She could be herself. Alexander, accustomed to control and rigidity, found himself disarmed by her lightness. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't the cold billionaire who ruled empires, but simply a man walking beside a woman who laughed spontaneously when she felt the wind ruffle her hair. The most memorable moment occurred during a simple dinner prepared by people close to Alexander. Juliet couldn't tell if it was the familiar atmosphere or the wine that lightened the mood, but something changed. For the first time, he began to talk about his past, not in calculated responses for the media, but in quiet confessions that carried pain and vulnerability. He spoke of his mother's absence, of the weight of taking on responsibilities too soon, of how he had learned to harden himself so as not to be destroyed. Juliet didn't interrupt, didn't try to correct or soften. She simply listened, her eyes fixed on him, empathizing with every detail of his expression. And it was precisely this sincere listening that made him open up even more. Juliet realized that behind the businessman lay a human being, carrying wounds hidden beneath expensive suits. There was fear, loneliness, and an immense need to be understood. And it was in that moment that she showed her strength. Instead of losing herself in Alexander's imposing presence, she offered him what he had never encountered in the business world: humanity. She said that everyone has scars, but that it is precisely these marks that make us real. And the silence that followed was more revealing than any speech. He looked at her differently, as if in that instant he had seen not just the woman pretending to be his fiancée, but someone who could be part of something much bigger. In the following days, the two grew even closer. They strolled through the countryside, shared stories, laughed at trivial situations, and created memories unwritten in any contract. Alexander, who always controlled time and movement, lost himself in the simplicity of Juliet's gestures. And Juliet, who had accepted the arrangement out of necessity, was surprised by how easily she let herself be carried away by his presence. The line between truth and lies began to blur, and the false engagement, created to deceive the world, now also deceived the hearts that sustained it. It's at this point in the story that we need to pause and reflect together. How many times have you found yourself experiencing something that started out as an obligation, but gradually transformed into a real feeling? That's the magic of human connections. They arise when we least expect them. And if this reflection has already touched you, take the opportunity to like it now, because it shows that stories like this resonate with you too. This simple gesture goes a long way towards strengthening the channel and bringing you more content that deeply touches your life. Returning to this intense plot, what frightened Alexander most was the realization that he was no longer in control. The man who lived by numbers, strategies, and predictions couldn't control what he felt every time Juliet smiled. Genuinely. And Juliet, no matter how hard she tried to convince herself that it was all just part of a contract, couldn't deny the warmth in her chest when he approached, nor the different sparkle in his eyes when their hands touched. The game of appearances was falling apart, and the pretense was giving way to something neither of them was prepared to face. And so, on this weekend that was supposed to be just another act of the charade, a question arose that would change everything. What would happen if they stopped pretending? The fake engagement was beginning to take on real form, and this transformation, though silent, was too powerful to ignore. The return of the past always carries a special weight, and in Alexander Reed's life it was no different. Everything seemed to be taking shape. The false engagement slowly transformed into something out of control, and Juliet no longer knew if she was acting or living. But fate has a cruel habit of testing people just when they begin to believe in something new. That's how Charlotte Hayes reappeared, like an elegant shadow, enveloped in expensive perfume and calculated words, ready to reclaim the place she believed still belonged to her. Charlotte wasn't just a distant memory. She had been Alexander's ex-fiancée, a woman who knew his weaknesses, his fears, and how to use them to her advantage. Her sudden presence seemed no coincidence. The business world was paying close attention to Alexander and Juliet's relationship, and Charlotte emerged as someone ready to plant doubts, both in the minds of the media and in the hearts of those close to her. With her natural ability to manipulate situations, she began appearing at events, always with insinuating smiles, dropping phrases that sparked speculation. "Some bonds are never broken," she said in interviews, fueling rumors and instigating journalists who already doubted the authenticity of that perfect engagement. The press, which until then had been captivated by the love story between the powerful billionaire and the dreamy architect, began to change its tone. Headlines appeared questioning whether it was all a carefully orchestrated act to save Alexander's image. Uncomfortable questions echoed at press conferences. Why would a man like him, accustomed to short-term relationships, choose Juliet? Why did everything seem to have happened so quickly? The pressure mounted, and each new article published was like a silent blow, weakening Juliet's confidence and fueling her insecurities. And as if facing the world's inquisitive gaze wasn't enough, Juliet now had to contend with Charlotte's presence. It was impossible to ignore how confidently she walked, as if every gesture was a reminder that she had once occupied that space beside Alexander. And deep down, Juliet began to wonder if she was nothing more than a convenient replacement, a pawn in a game that was never really about her. Charlotte's words, laced with venom disguised as elegance, echoed, "Do you really think you can be different from the others? He always comes back to where he started." These phrases, repeated at strategic moments, planted seeds of doubt that Juliet couldn't erase. Alexander, with his cool and controlled demeanor, didn't help. He tried to maintain an air of indifference to his ex-fiancée's advances, but his silence only reinforced in Juliet's mind the feeling that she would never be more than a compromise, a sham created to save an empire rather than build a life. With each passing day, she felt more used, as if her role had been merely to fulfill part of the contract, and now, with Charlotte back, her presence was dispensable. Juliet began to withdraw. There was no longer the same sparkle in her eyes during public appearances, and even her most rehearsed gestures lost their power. The public noticed, the media speculated, and Alexander, even though he tried to hide it, felt the impact of that distance. But Juliet didn't want to admit her feelings. For her, all of this was confirmation of what she had feared from the beginning. Alexander would never see her as anything more than a pawn in his game, a woman hired to play the perfect bride until he could get back to his old life. And here, my friend, who is following this narrative, I want to invite you to reflect. How many times in your life have you felt used or replaceable? How many times has someone made you believe you were only valuable within an agreement, within a condition, but never as who you truly are? This is a wound many carry, and that's why this story resonates so deeply. It speaks not only of Juliet and Alexander, but of all of us, of the times we've been tested by the return of ghosts from the past. If this part of the plot has already awakened memories in you, please like the video here, because it shows me that you identify with this theme and helps me bring you even more stories that resonate with your life. Gradually, the tension between the three became unbearable. Juliet, increasingly suffocated, began to consider leaving. Perhaps it would be better to give up, break the contract, abandon the charade, and save what remained of her dignity. But the cruel and inevitable truth is that real feelings were already intertwined in that act. And to walk away would not only be breaking an agreement, it would also be betraying what her own heart was already beginning to recognize, even if she didn't have the courage to admit it. The momentous event that would define Alexander Reed's future approached like a storm about to break. It was the most anticipated night of the year, the gathering that brought together investors, businesspeople, and members of the press from across the country. Everything had been planned to be impeccable: the sophisticated setting, the polished speeches, the billion-dollar contracts about to be signed. For Alexander, this was the decisive moment, the chance to cement his image before the world, to show that he was not just a cold strategist but also a stable man, worthy of the trust everyone sought to place in him. For Juliet Carter, however, that night carried much greater weight. It was the final straw for a performance that had already cost her more than she could have imagined. After so many doubts, so many wounds opened by Charlotte's return, she believed her role was coming to an end. Juliet got ready in silence, donning an elegant gown that transformed her into a picture of perfection. But behind the practiced smile reflected in the mirror, her heart was broken. She knew she would have to face Charlotte again that night. Alexander's ex-fiancé had not only returned to reclaim her place, but had also managed to plant doubts in the hearts of the media, and, worse still, in Juliet's own convictions. The young architect felt fragile, like a disposable pawn in a power play. Still, she decided to fulfill her final part of the contract, maintaining her composure until the end. The hall was packed. Cameras and flashbulbs vying for every moment. Alexander entered accompanied by Juliet, the two holding hands, as the script predicted. To the audience, it was the perfect image, the confident billionaire and his stunning bride. But inside, Juliet wondered how many of those people actually believed what they saw. Charlotte, impeccable as always, watched from afar, certain she still held power over Alexander. And at a strategic moment, she approached, smiling, as if she truly owned the space. Murmurs arose, journalists rushed to record the scene, and Juliet felt the crushing weight of standing before the woman who represented everything she could never be. When it was time for his speech, Alexander took the stage. Silence fell over the room. Everyone awaited his words, expecting them to be about business, investments, and numbers. But at that moment, the man who had always controlled everything made a different decision. Instead of getting bogged down in formalities, he looked directly at Juliet, who was watching him with her heart racing, and said something no one expected to hear. He spoke about trust, about stability, but not in the business sense. He spoke about how he had discovered that true strength lies not just in contracts or strategies, but in the ability to open up, to allow someone to break through the barriers we build to protect ourselves. Then, before the press, investors, and even Charlotte, Alexander declared that his love for Juliet wasn't part of a deal. It wasn't an act. It wasn't a strategy. It was real. His firm voice echoed throughout the room, leaving everyone stunned. Charlotte, for a second, lost her composure, unable to believe he was willing to burn bridges with the past like that. Juliet, in turn, felt tears threaten to fall. Her heart, so often torn between reason and feeling, now received the naked truth. What had begun as a lie had become something genuine. The shock was collective. Investors murmured, journalists jotted down every word, photographers fired flashes nonstop. Juliet still hesitated, but when Alexander stepped off the stage and approached her, everything around her seemed to vanish. He took her hand, and in a gesture that needed no explanation, pulled her close. The kiss happened in front of everyone, not as part of a contract, not as a media stunt, but as proof that two completely different people, initially united by a cold agreement, had found something much greater than they expected. The hall erupted in applause, and even those who suspected it couldn't deny the intensity of the moment. Charlotte left the room in silence, knowing she had lost not only a space, but a man who had finally chosen to live his truth. Juliet, overcome with emotion, let herself be enveloped by the kiss, allowing her armor to fall away completely. And in that moment, before the entire world, she accepted that the lie that had united them had become true love. And now I want to ask you, who are living this story with me, do you believe that love can blossom even amidst lies and appearances? Do you think fate can use even the most unlikely situations to reveal true feelings? Share your perspective in the comments, because each opinion offers a new perspective for us to reflect on together. And if this climax moved you, if you felt your heart race along with Juliet's, please leave a like right now. This simple gesture strengthens the channel and shows me that stories like this resonate with you. The kiss in front of the press not only sealed a new chapter for Alexander and Juliet, but also paved the way for something even greater. Because when two lives meet so unexpectedly, what follows is always uncharted territory, full of challenges, discoveries, and truths yet to be revealed. And so, what began as a simple, cold, and calculated contract ended up becoming a journey of discovery, vulnerability, and true love. Alexander and Juliet's story shows us that, no matter how much we try to control every detail, life always finds a way to surprise us. Sometimes, it's precisely in improvisation, in what wasn't scripted, that the most real feelings emerge. The moral of this story is clear: love doesn't follow contracts, doesn't respect imposed rules, and isn't tied to appearances. It's born in the details, in spontaneous gestures, in the courage to open up even when everything seems like a sham. And that's what makes this story so powerful, because it reminds us that, even amidst the masks we wear, there's always the chance to find someone who sees who we truly are. If you've made it this far, take this message with you: never underestimate the power of the connections life throws your way. The unlikely could be exactly what you need to transform your story. And if this ending touched you, if this reflection resonated with you, please like and subscribe to the channel. This way, you support this work and continue receiving stories that not only entertain, but also inspire and touch the soul. Because, in the end, what truly matters is what we can feel and share.